right. Evening, everyone. Welcome to another Peaceful Solution Character Education Teacher Certification course or class. If you all please be seated if you're standing. Welcome to those who are joining us both locally and online, who are joining us on our official Peaceful Solution Character Education Facebook page. As we mentioned before, you can always go and click that drop-down menu, that tab, and pull down more. Click on more, where we have the other books that are listed there. Character, acceptance are the first two that we've already covered, and now we are currently in self-control. And we are almost out of self-control, if you can believe that. It's been moving right along, but it's very important that we grasp the concepts and understand everything that we've covered up until this point and up into where we are right now in self-control regarding self-control and the environment. And that's where we're at this evening. We are in Unit 3, Chapter 7, and I think on my slide I accidentally put Chapter 6, but it's actually supposed to be Chapter 7, Self-Control and the Environment. Now, why is that so important? Many might ask, what's the big deal? I breathe every day. I get my food from the grocery store, and I buy my clothes from the local shop. Well, everything in our environment is dependent upon how we conduct ourselves within that environment, whether we practice self-control or whether we don't. Like we're learning, and we're going to cover as we're going to be starting on page 194 today. But as we learn, what we put in to our environment is what we get out of it. You think about it, because all of this, even though we're talking about environment, remember everything that we covered and the three basic categories of morality: behavior and attitude towards all life, behavior and attitude towards possessions and property, and behavior and attitude toward the environment. If we have a negative attitude, if we have a negative, our behavior is negative in regards to our actions toward the environment, then of course the environment is going to pretty much spit back out what we put into it. Remember the statement in the, I believe the acceptance unit, it was garbage in, garbage out, right? What we put into our minds, that's what we get out from our behavior, our thoughts, our actions and so forth. Well, it's the same thing, when you think about something as simple as soil, and we're going to talk a little bit about soil today. But when you think about something as simple as soil, you take, and I like how one of the teachers I listened to a long time ago, he kind of compared our minds, our subconscious minds, to fertile soil, garden soil. And he said that, your mind will take a seed, right? And I think I've mentioned this before. Your mind will take any seed, just like soil. Soil will take any seed, and you compare seeds with thoughts, right? We plant the seed of thought in your mind, right? You take a thought and you plant it in your mind, your subconscious mind, and it'll take that seed, and if given the proper amount of water and sunlight and oxygen and nutrients and so forth, it's going to produce whatever is the instructions in that seed, the DNA in that seed, the package of information that's locked in that seed. That's what's going to be pushed out of the earth, right? Well, it's the same thing with our thoughts. And if we put something like poison ivy, let's say that, I think a lot of people know what poison ivy is. Nightshade is another poison, hemlock and things like that. If we put something like that in regards to thoughts, negative thoughts, into our minds or into the soil, that's what's going to come up, right? And if you go walking through a crowded foresty area and you rub against a little bit of poison ivy, well, you're more than likely going to get a poison ivy infection, right? You're going to get a poison ivy rash, where I don't know if you've ever had poison ivy before, but it causes a lot of severe, intense itching, right? And swelling and so forth. Some people have even made the mistake of burning poison ivy, and those oils get into the lungs and into the throat. And have you ever had a itch inside your throat that you just can't scratch? That's how bad it can get. I remember one of the skits they had on one of the shows, they had something called the lung brush to help smokers clean out their lungs after a day of smoking. You know, it's almost like you want to just take one of those bottle washers and stick it down your throat just to scratch the inside of it. Well, you can't do that, you know, and we can't immediately undo the negative consequences or the consequences of not showing respect, not practicing self-control in regards to the decisions we make that affect our environment. You know, we have, and we will talk a little bit about, you know, some of the previous teachers talked about the STDs and those things spreading and how those things get into the earth, how they get into our water supply system, how they get into the ocean and they affect the fish, they affect the coral reef, they affect the, you know, the biologic, the life in the oceans and the soil and even in the air, right? You can't just snap your finger and undo those things. So, you know, as we're learning, it's best to educate ourselves from the very beginning and make right choices so we don't have to go back and deal with the consequences of making wrong choices. Because some things can take years to repair. And we're not going to go, I don't want to jump ahead, but because we don't want to give any spoilers here, but we're going to see how, you know, some of the decisions that farmers made years ago, you know, in the early 90s, some of the decisions that farmers made in regards to what they fed certain animals and their quick response to try to deal with it actually caused something that was fairly localized to spread and to contaminate the majority of the earth, right? When you're dealing with something like the earth, you're dealing with, like we mentioned in the previous classes, a living, breathing organism. As you know, we brought out, the earth is not just, you know, a static rock. You know, the wind blows, the trees sway. Well, the trees, you don't look at the tree and see that, you know, it's taking carbon dioxide in and it's putting oxygen out. It's, you know, the trees also give off a portion of water. You know, water evaporates from the leaves of the trees. They also absorb it and carry it down the trunk of the trees down into the earth. You know, it's a two-way system with trees and pretty much any plant, okay? The same thing taking place with the ocean. You know, there's so much life and so many activities going on. It's like going into, you know, a Walmart or something and you going and picking up a can of coffee off the shelf and then going to the checkout lane and buying it and walking out to your car. Well, you didn't see, you know, all the work that went into the first person who had the desire to grow coffee beans, right? And they plotted out land and they tilled it up and they nurtured it and they watered it and they planted the coffee beans and they cared for it and they, you know, they fertilized it and they harvested it and they processed them and then they sent them off to a company that, you know, packaged them or ground them, and somebody had to make the packaging for it, right? Even if it's a plastic bag or a canvas bag or a container, a plastic or a glass or a steel container. Well, someone had to mine that steel. Someone had to manufacture that plastic. Someone had to weave that burlap bag or that burlap sack or whatever, you know, and make the rope to tie it off so that they could put the coffee in. Well, then someone had to have a trucking company to go and bring that coffee to the store or to the distribution place. Well, where'd the truck come from? Where'd the oil and the diesel that powered the truck, where'd those tires come from on that truck, right? The driver and the clothes and everything that's been, there's so much that goes into you just buying one thing of coffee, okay? And it's the same thing that takes place in our environment every day. But when you factor in the human element of it, okay, like it was mentioned from the previous teachers in the classes prior to this one here, you know, animals, fish, birds, you know, trees, plants, you know, they don't create any consequences for themselves, right? They function properly in the way that they were designed to without creating consequences. They don't create pollution that harms the atmosphere. They don't create pollution that harms the water system or the soil, right? It's mankind. We're the ones that have done that, okay? So that's what we're looking at, and that's why we have to take these lessons seriously, excuse me, self-control, because if we don't pay attention to ourselves and the thoughts that go into our mind. Remember, every action starts with a thought. And this is something that you really, I know we've mentioned it before, and we're going to mention it more and more. And even after we're out of this book and going back to self-control with the next two units, well, more than two, we have to keep that in the forefront of our minds and in the minds of our students, that we have to consider, stop and think. Stop and think before we do anything. And that's what we're talking about here, because a lot of the consequences, a lot of the we talked a little bit about deforestation last class. We talked a little bit, just a tiny bit, about water pollution and water contamination. I was just looking at a video a couple days ago, how I think it was in India. There's a big drive to push for the development of toilets. Just something as simple as toilets. Outhouses really is mostly what they were driving for, because a lot of the people in kind of the rural areas, and even in the city areas, if you ever, just go and study a little bit about the Ganges River, right? It's considered a pretty special river to a lot of people in that area, but it's also a pretty polluted river, okay? And many people get sick from it. Many people die. A lot of the local people, they kind of have a somewhat immunity built up to the things that are in there. But a lot of things get dumped. I mean, sewage, raw sewage from 2+ million people a day, are dumped into that water, that river. And just down the river, just down the stream from the outlet of that sewage pipe, are people, washing up and, getting water to take back home to wash their clothes, or to bathe in, or to cook with, okay? And so they've got a big drive over there, and it's been going on for a long time to build and place toilets. I think they had a drive to this, like 2 million toilets or something. It might be more than that, about 2 million toilets throughout the country, because most of the people, a great majority of the people, wherever they are, that's where they go to the bathroom. And if it rains, that water runs off, and it carries not only the soil, but everything that's dumped on the soil down into the water supply, down the streets and everything else, And so you can see how just that one thing, not properly disposing of waste, human waste, right? And like, if you remember some of the classes where Chris talked about and William talked about, the things, the choices, the immoral choices that, mankind chooses to engage in with themselves, it creates a lot of diseases. Well, those diseases come out in the waste. They don't just stay in the body. They don't just stay in the person. If you remember some years ago, I say some years, but, months ago, if you've been watching the news, you've seen how, particularly, I can remember, it's probably several states, but one of the states that stands out to me is the state of Florida. Because when they were trying to catch spikes of new cases or a new surge of coronavirus outbreaks, they weren't going to local communities and, swabbing people's noses and throats. They weren't going to nursing homes and checking people out there, or going to the local bars. No, they were going to the water or the sewage treatment plants. That's where they were going. And they were able to detect new surges coming surges of coronavirus in the sewage. How many other things are they able to detect in the sewage, right? And a lot of big cities, they take that water and they clean it up, okay? And they supposedly take the sludge that's compressed and dried out, got all the juices out of it, so you can make sure you get the most for your money, the biggest bang for your buck, right? And they send that to a landfill. Supposedly they send it to a landfill. I don't know. It might go other places too. You got to be careful with that. Sometimes I wonder about that. Made with 90% post-consumer waste, you kind of wonder what it is, which part of the waste that you're getting when you're drinking out of a bottle, or, using a belt or a shoe or something like that. But that water that's taken off of there then goes through several processes, right, where it's filtered and cleaned and, treated with chlorine and UV light and so forth, and then it comes out and sent to your tap, and it's considered safe to drink, okay? Most homeowners will take that water if they live in the city, and they'll further run it through a filtering system in their house because they know how contaminated things are. I think Flint, Michigan was another place that had a terrible water supply system. Their water infrastructure was so deteriorated, from the water coming through the pipes through the utility companies, that there were, I think it was high concentrations of lead and possibly arsenic and other things, and people were getting sick, and it was just a massive breakdown of the infrastructure. So we can see how just these utilities or these resources that we depend upon, if we're not careful in how we use them or careful how we treat them, they can come back and have a negative impact on us, the end user, okay? So again, what goes around comes around, right? And this is what we're going to be starting with on page 194 in your book. Now, we're still in the third procedure, and I did read that last class. We're kind of in that last paragraph there. Ask students if they can name any of the consequences that come from technology. That's what we talked about a little bit last class, some of the technological advances. And instruct students to turn to page 194 and read what goes around comes around, and have students complete the accompanying exercise. Let them evaluate their answers for the test on page 197, and I'm pretty sure we won't get that far today. All right, the test is down here, but all the way to 197. So let's look here on page 194 at the very top here. It says, have you ever heard the expression, what goes around comes around? What this means is that what you put into something is what you get out of it. Okay, kind of like the example that I was just giving about the seed that's planted in the soil, right? What you put into it is what you get out of it. What we put into our mind, and think about all the work that we've done up until this point, and understanding what character is, understanding what is the difference between a positive and a negative character, understanding how to recognize the influences and the values that affect the development of our character, right? Because, we're all born with kind of a baseline. We're kind of born with certain characteristics, certain traits, certain personalities that are there at the onset of birth. Now, some of these things are developed. Some of them are kind of innate. They're part of our genetics and things of that nature. But some of them we're learned. They are learned, okay? But once we get to the age, at least for ourselves, before that, it was up to our parents to teach us, to guide us, to impress certain things in our hearts and our minds. But once we get to the age of accountability where we can stop and think, evaluate our choices, evaluate the things that we value, right? What we value, those things help to shape and form our character. Whether they're positive or negative, it's going to be the same. It's going to, create positive or negative characteristics. And then make decisions that will direct us on the path to developing and maintaining a positive character. Because it's not just enough, as we covered in, I think, chapter 3, maybe chapter 4 of the character unit, maintaining our character, our positive character. Now that I have it, how do I keep it? Well, because we're going to be faced with daily challenges, things that will test our resolve, setbacks, pitfalls, curveballs, things of that nature, as we've mentioned time after time again, that's going to test our resolve to maintain our positive character. Well, it's no different in how we interact with our society, right? Imagine that you're the president of a large corporation that manufactures a particular item, and there is a possible byproduct that is potentially harmful to the environment. As a president of that corporation that you've taken over, how would you properly dispose of that or neutralize that where it is no longer harmful to the environment? Okay, that would be a challenge that you would have. If you find out that it's harming the environment, whether it's the soil or the water system or the air, now it's your job to find out what you can do to eliminate that harm, because it's going to eventually come back and affect you in a negative way, but infect those people who affect those people who you might not even have anything to do with. Remember, that's respect. Respect for all life. to have consideration, care, and concern. Even if you don't know the person, even if you don't see them, we can't have the mindset of, that stuff, that'll be there for 100 years, or it'll take 1,000 years for that to cause a problem. Kind of like one of the teachers mentioned about burying nuclear waste in the ocean. Parts of the ocean that have nuclear, spent radioactive, what do they call that stuff? Wastewater or whatever it is. They put them in those 55-gallon drums and they just sink them in oceans or seas and so forth. Well, that stuff eventually rusts and it starts to leak out. And the next thing you know, you're going on a fishing trip and you think you've caught the biggest fish in your life, but it's got like 3 eyes and, human legs. Who knows, maybe it's got an actual cat face with whiskers, which catfish, I know they have whiskers, but it possibly has fur on it. Who knows, because these things become they develop defects because of mutations in their cellular structure because of something that mankind irresponsibly placed in the ocean, not caring that potentially it's going to leak and cause damage to that ecosystem. An ecosystem is another word we might hear as we move forward in this class. So what this means is that what you put into something is what you get out of it. The effort and thought that we put into how we care for our environment will determine what we reap will determine whether we reap positive or negative results. The effort and thought, right? Think about this now. Like I mentioned before, compare our environment to ourselves. Okay? Compare our environment to our minds. Compare our environment to our bodies, because they're both living, breathing things. And if we contaminate, if we pollute our bodies, we're going to pollute the environment. If we contaminate and if we pollute the environment, we're going to pollute our bodies. Okay? Because everything is dependent upon each species doing their jobs. Okay? If you remember page 11 here, this kind of made me think about it. Back to page 11 in your self-control unit. Because it says our efforts and our thoughts, the efforts and thoughts that we put into how we care for our environment will determine whether we reap positive or negative thoughts, or positive or negative results, If you go back to page 11 and look at that heading underneath, guard your mind. And what does this have to do with the environment? Now, as we've mentioned before, and if you really paid attention to the previous classes, the positive or the negative results that our environment bears that burden of, or that benefit of, is determined on mankind's activities. And so we can see now, just taking this information that we have up to this point in the peaceful solution, we can see based on the response of our environment, take the community, just take the prisons, take the crime rate, take those things and just set those off to the side and look at how our environment is responding to our activities. That'll give you the insight of the character of mankind. Because if it was positive, our environment would be all pristine, healthy, strong, beneficial, right? We would still have grapes that are that big or apples that are that big. I remember eating grapefruits that were like that big, 25 years ago. Now grapefruits are like that big. They look like tangerines. Is that a grapefruit? That looks like, is it still growing? Did you guys pick it too early? Right? Fruits and vegetables are much smaller than what they used to be. They don't have the nutritional value that they used to have. They barely taste like anything, right? I never growing up saw a personal watermelon. I think that's just what they call them now. Watermelon that I grew up, you'd get a hernia carrying those things. That's how big those things were. They were absolutely enormous, right? After my mom scooped it out, I could actually hide in it, right? No, they weren't that big, but watermelon were big and they were juicy and they were very flavorful, right? And things aren't that way anymore. It was kind of funny because I think William was talking about how Oh no, I think I was mentioning it before. You know how the things we get in the stores, they cost more, but you get less of it. And I was getting a box of Raisin Bran, which I like Raisin Bran, and I remember Raisin Bran. The box used to be like that thick, you know, that tall and that wide. And I went there the other day, and the box was like that thick, and it was the family size box. And I thought, well, it must be a family of ants because you're only going to get 2 bowls out of that thing. But this is where our society has come to now, you know, and part of it, companies are trying to compensate because there's less things available, but they're not compensating in the fact of saving you money because the smaller box costs you even more, probably twice as much as it used to beforehand. Well, go back to page 11 here because we're talking about our efforts and our thoughts, right? Our efforts and our thoughts in regards to the environment. And when we covered this all the way back in guarding your mind, because there are so many things that are in society, especially the influences that are there to bombard your mind continuously to I don't know, give you the incentive, I guess is for lack of better words, to follow the crowd in practicing immorality, okay? Because it seems more fun, it seems more joyous and so forth. But look here, it says another key concept in developing self-control is to be aware that your actions begin with your thoughts, including the actions that affect our environment. It is very easy to say, I just did it. I wasn't thinking. But the truth is, we are always thinking. Thoughts into your mind at the speed of light. Thoughts about ourselves, others, things we need to accomplish, and things we want. These thoughts then lead to feelings, which in turn lead to behavior. Now look down to the next paragraph there. It says, it is up to you to determine if your thoughts can help you build your character or if they can lead to choices you will regret. Although thoughts flow in and out of our minds, we have the power to control what thoughts we focus on and what we let go. And that's important to remind your students that even though, you know, they might be surrounded by a society of people making immoral choices and doing things that negatively impact the environment and influencing them to do things that will negatively impact their health, which will go back into the environment in one way, shape, form, or another, they have to choose what they want to focus on, right? And what they want to ignore. But in order for them to be able to do that, they have to understand their values. They have to know what it is their value. They have to know, like we covered in character and acceptance unit, they have to understand their purpose. They have to have goals for themselves, right? Remember, not having goals in life is like running a race with no finish line. If a person doesn't have goals and they don't understand that they have a purpose, then they can be easily persuaded to go in any direction. Because what difference does it make? You know, as long as I'm moving forward, I'm going somewhere. Well, yeah, you could be moving forward to the edge of the cliff and you'll be going down right after you get to the edge. But you have to have goals. You have to have a purpose. And this is something, even as you're dealing with your students in this age group, 11 through 13, you know, a lot of them still, they're not gonna have it figured out. I mean, we didn't at that age. And this is where the teaching comes in, you know, to help them, to give them kind of a foundation, because their values might change, their desires might change, their goals might change, right? But a part of their purpose should be to be a beneficial, positive influence on society, right? That should be a part of their purpose. And the goals along the way, even with that one purpose in mind, their goals along the way will keep them in the right direction, right? And so as teachers, it's up to us to plant that seed in the minds of our students. And in the classes and the activities that go along with this and the conversations throughout the day, you know, that's like the sunshine and the watering, right? And the nutrients that help to keep these things fresh in their mind and start it to growing. So, and get it to the point where many of us have, I mean, I've raised a couple of plants in my life. I'm no green thumb, right? But, you know, I've raised a couple of little trees. I remember when I was in school and the Arbor Day, came around. I don't know which day that is. And some people came to school and they were telling us about Arbor Day and arborist and trees and everything. And part of the thing that we got at the end of the day was we got a little tree, right? And I remember getting that little tree and taking that tree. It was just a tiny little sapling thing, and planting it. And then it was like from that point you had to guard it, right? You had to guard it because you had animals, you had raccoons, right? These are the negative influences. These are the people that want to destroy your character, the raccoons. And even though they might seem cute, those little Bambis coming out, yeah, they're going to eat your tree, right? They're going to try to take it from you, okay? You got to be careful of the cows too. Don't ever trust those cows, right? Because they'll just step on your tree and eat it. So you have all these things you've got to do to guard it until it becomes strong enough to stand on its own and to start the process. Remember, trees, they first start taking things in through their leaves until they get a root system. And then once the root system is strong enough, then that tree can stand on its own. And then it gets so strong that it can withstand 100-mile-an-hour winds. Well, that's the way we have to become, right? And it's not easy to begin with. And we always have to guard our thoughts, but as teachers, we have to kind of guard our thoughts and guard the thoughts and the influences in the minds of our students, because we've got to get them to the point where they're able to stand up strong on their own and resist these negative influences and to make choices that will keep them focused on the right direction, which is, of course, building and maintaining a positive character. And as a result, the things that they do they're going to be a benefit to society. They're going to be a benefit to their family. They're going to be a benefit to their community, their neighborhood, their coworkers, their schoolmates, and so forth, because they understand what their purpose is. And all their goals are helping them to move in the direction of reaching that purpose or accomplishing that purpose. So just for your notes, I'm going to read here, going back to values and understanding our efforts and thoughts. This is from the character unit on page 6 when we look at values here. It says, above that, it says the next most important factor in helping you develop your character is called values. Values are what you believe in or feel strongly about, and they also play a key role in developing your character. So we can't look at that as all too light. Values. We can't look at that as something that we just take lightly, because they play a key role. In fact, they're one of the 6 factors that help make up a person's character. Very important. And remember, anything that has the ability to change your values has the ability to change your character. So we want to be very mindful about our values, but not only that, how we go about obtaining the things we value. Remember the example that we gave about the woman that in the Walmart parking lot who valued a child, having her own child for whatever reason. She couldn't have one, or lost them, or whatever the case might be. And she waited till the mother brought her child to the car, and when she went to go put the cart back, she went and tried to kidnap the child, right? Now, was it wrong for her to value desiring a child? No. But her morality, or the lack thereof, caused her to do something that brought harm to someone else. Okay? We have to couple all these things together in order to bring about a peaceful solution. So it says here, the sum total of everything you value becomes, it's not already there, it's not established, okay, especially when you're dealing with young people. And sometimes you've got to totally reevaluate and totally change up your values, okay? Because if they were guiding you down a path of destruction, then now you have to reevaluate those things and assess them, get rid of the negative, eliminate the negative, and accentuate the positive so that you can form a new system. Because that's what the sum total of everything you value becomes, which is your value system. Now I just want to read here an excerpt from the character unit, chapter 4. And keep this in mind, because we're talking about the efforts and thoughts that we put into how we care for the environment. Will determine whether we reap positive or negative results. Well, we can't put in positive results, positive thoughts in regards to the environment unless we've developed the lessons, the knowledge of the difference between what positive and negative is. And this is the note to the teacher in chapter 4. Now that I have it, how do I keep it? And this is on page LP4A in the character unit. It says, this chapter explores that it is not just about acquiring the things we want, we must also care for, guard, and protect the possessions that we treasure. Okay, now you think when we think about the earth, we have not acquired the earth. All right, we're here. We're born on the earth. But I think that it's safe to say that even if you don't think about it, you treasure the resources that the earth provides. Everybody in here is breathing. I'm sure at some point today you drank a little water or juice or something, probably ate some food. The clothes on all of our backs, they came from the earth. The shoes on our feet as well. The tables that we're sitting on, even this paper that we're reading from our books, all that has come from the earth. So we treasure these things, but we have to be mindful about how we care for them. In this way, we will retain their value and keep them functioning properly. Now remember, as we talked about the microorganisms, the microbiome, the ecosystem, the tiny little bugs, as you want to call it, and put it simply, in the air, in the water, in the soil, on us, that makes up us, and so forth. They need to be able to function properly and to do their job, but in order for them to be able to do so, they have to have healthy food, clean water to drink, and air to breathe, and so forth. Herein lies the art of maintenance. If you look down or take a note down to their second chapter or second paragraph there on that page, it says, in this chapter, students will learn that their character is one of the most important possessions, and just like any other possession, it must be maintained through self-control, consistency, and discipline. This chapter will prepare students for situations that could test their resolve to make positive decisions. Now on page 58 here in the character unit, so we see what values are. We know what they are, but we kind of went back as a reminder there. In regards to negative values, it says negative values will keep you from developing a moral character. Remember, a moral character is one that encourages you or directs you or distinguishes between right and wrong, and one that follows the rules. So be careful about what you value. Another important aspect about values is how you achieve the things that matter to you. How you achieve your values must never be in conflict with developing a positive character. So like we said there, the things that we want, the things that we value, the goals that we have, they must all be in line with our positive character traits. All right. So the effort and thought that we put into how we care for our environment will determine whether we reap positive or negative results. Now, I want you to take in mind here, when you think about this, on the next slide, number, slide 2 on effort. Slide number 2 is, it's a simple definition of the word effort. The use of physical or mental energy to do something. Exertion. The use of physical or mental energy to do something. All right. In other words, effort means work. The amount of work that we put into how we care for our environment. So in other words, we can't sit back and just hope that our environment will be clean, hope that we'll stay healthy and strong as individuals that are a part of the ecosystem, our environment. Hope that we don't steal, hope that we don't bring harm to someone. No, we have to actually put forth effort. We have to put forth work in obtaining those goals or in accomplishing those goals. And that will help us to bring about these results in the environment that we're looking for. Look at the next paragraph. It says, if we continue contaminating the soil and air, then we will no longer have clean, fresh air to breathe or rich soil in which to plant. If you think the air you breathe is fresh enough, then consider this cold, hard fact. Now, this was in 1948, where this example here is given here. It says, in air pollution can kill. In 1948, 19 people died as a result of polluted air in the town of Donora, Pennsylvania. And if you've ever looked up Donora, 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 Pennsylvania, there's actually quite a bit on it that shows that time period. In fact, I meant to actually bring some here. I'll see if I can just pull this up real quick. Don't want to take too much time on it, but this was a result here of smog in 1948 that began October 27th and lasted until October 31st, when rain cleared the combined smoke, fog, and pollution that had become trapped over the town. I was just trying to remember here. But 19 people died as a result of it. A lot of people had a lot of respiratory illnesses and issues. And this here is a picture that was taken on the evening in Donora, Pennsylvania. And this is in 1948. There we go. You see? And it's kind of hard to see, but, it was pretty much completely contaminated with smoke, smog, and things of that nature, all the way down to ground level. And some of the examples of history, because they actually took a lot of pictures at this time, you saw kind of like, here we go. You kind of saw a lot of the people, like in the time period of the Dust Bowl. You saw a lot of people. Well, I'm not going to be able to open it right now. But anyway, a lot of people walking around with masks on their face because that's how bad the pollution was. If you've ever seen these same things that took place in China, the big city of China, Hong Kong, that city, China's a country, but the big city of not Hong Kong, Beijing, China, and a lot of the other areas, pollution and smog is really bad in those areas as well. And a lot of people, they wear the face mask just as a normal everyday thing because the air quality is so poor. Well, oddly enough, it was interesting because after coronavirus came about and people weren't able to get out and mingle and do the things that they were doing, it was interesting because they actually detected that the air, and visually, the air just started to clean up. It started to clear up, so to speak, which means it's the human activity. It's evidence that the human activity is what brings about these detriments to our environment. But in 1948, 19 people died as a result of polluted air in the town of Donora, Pennsylvania. If you avoid eating anything green so that contaminated soil won't affect you, well, guess what? Your diet of burgers and French fries is also affected by contaminants in the soil because cows eat grass and potatoes grow underground. So, you see, how we treat the earth affects our lives in more ways than we can imagine. All right. And the ecosystem, as we've been bringing out before, everything depends, every species within that ecosystem, every population of species has a part to play. Now, like we've mentioned, the deer, the birds, the fish, and the things that live in the atmosphere and in the soil, they do their jobs just fine, right? The main factor in the ecosystem's negative effects comes from mankind. Our next slide there, notice here the definition of the word ecosystem. Now, we brought this out before. It says an ecosystem is a structural and functional unit of ecology where the living organisms interact with each other and the surrounding environment. Now think about that and think about the part we play and how we interact with the surrounding environment, our activities with one another, our activities with the things that we draw from the earth and that we put back into the earth. In other words, an ecosystem is a chain of interactions between organisms, which we are, mankind is also an organism, and their environment. The term ecosystem was first coined by A.G. Tansley, an English botanist, in 1935, just a year after the author's birth there. All right. just wanted to show you something else here on the next slide there, because when we think about, look at the little earth there on page 194, and you also see this same thing here. This is the triple arrowed logo, and of course this has become the universal recycling symbol. You see it on cans, you see it on bags, you see it on plastic, steel, all over the place. I didn't realize it was as old as it was, but it was formulated a very long time ago. But did you know that the design originally started as a money-making idea for a Chicago-based packaging company, or that the logo was created as part of a design contest to mark the first official Earth Day? So the recycling symbol came into a global recognition in the early 1970s when a design contest was held by a Chicago-based company, Container Corporation of America, a large producer of recycled paperboard. They sponsored a contest for art students and design students at high school and colleges across the country to raise awareness of environmental issues and that would symbolize the paper recycling process. The winning logo was designed by Gary Anderson, then a 23-year-old student at the University of Southern California. The image we now know as the universal recycling symbol was unveiled on the first ever Earth Day in April of 1970. The symbol is made up of 3 arrows in a triangle inspired by a Mobius loop, the surface that had only one side and no end. Each arrow twists and turns itself, and all 3 arrows chase each other. The symbol is a perfect representation of recycling, because we take something and we repurpose it. We make it new again, all right? And that's what we get in most cases. And a lot of things are naturally recycled, like we talked about water and the water cycle, right? And how the water goes into the earth. We draw it out of lakes and streams and rivers or from underground aquifers, and we drink that water, and then we dispose of it. It goes back into the earth in the form of a septic system, or a hole in the ground or whatever, and that kind of trickles down and it filters, and it actually becomes something usable again when the earth is able to do its job. And that's why it's important that the soil is healthy. I lived in Ohio, in some of the rural lands, the farmlands a little south of us. There was a big concern because a lot of the farmers, their well water had become contaminated because of the tremendous amount of pesticides that were being used in those areas. Now, you think about pesticides, and in some of the videos that we've seen and some of the things that you can see in your own research, a lot of those pesticides, they're usually just sprayed by planes. Or a tractor will go through and it'll, aerosolize the liquid pesticide onto the plants, and it'll land on the leaves and the surface of the plant, and some of it will get on the ground. But think about it, most of that stuff that's put in the air eventually makes its way down into the soil. And all those liquids from rain and everything, it pushes its way through the soil down into the underground aquifers. There's been a lot of issues with companies that manufacture a large amount of pesticides. In fact, an enormous amount of lawsuits that was brought against the company called Monsanto, which got bought out by someone else, Bayer, I believe, because of their Roundup Ready products and the effects that they were having on not just the plants and the animals and the soil, but of the people who worked around those things. A lot of people were being found to have certain types of cancers and tumors in their livers and their spleens and their backs and things of that nature. A lot of children were born with birth defects, and of course we'll probably bring some of those things out later. But, a lot of the things that pretty much most of the things that they formulate in order to generate more profit, right? Because that company had manufactured genetically modified seed that would only be activated by their pesticides. In fact, they were suing a lot of farmers who were found to have their seeds, because of cross-contamination, pollination, a naturally occurring process, their GMO seeds on non-GMO farms. And they were actually winning lawsuits and taking farms from honest, hardworking farmers because it was a patented seed and you couldn't have it. Well, they didn't use those seeds. They didn't buy them, but it was found on their farms, okay? But those seeds did way more harm than benefit, okay? Because the way seeds are, they produce enough seed to make more plants, okay? A seed is not a, what do they call it? Like a self-destructing seed. It's only, they made seed that you can only use one time. But that's not how seeds are originally created. You take one seed, like I mentioned about the apple tree, and you can get thousands of seeds off of that one seed when that apple tree grows up and is able to produce many, many apples. Well, the soils have become contaminated as a result of these harmful pesticides being used. There are natural pesticides. There are actually plants that are naturally, they have natural pesticides, and you can plant them next to your plants that you're trying to protect certain things from, and they'll keep the pest off, and they won't do harm to you. There are insects, there's bugs, there's animals, right? I remember watching a film about a family that was striving to go 100% organic and everything, and they had come up to a point in their process where they were getting a ton of snails that were on their plants. And they didn't want to use harmful pesticides, but they eventually found out from somebody else who was a lot more educated in natural, organic farming. Ducks, geese, right? They love snails. They're the ones that love escargot, or whatever you call the snails, And they were able to control that pest without doing harm to the plants. And the things that the geese produced, the ducks produced in the soil, it actually fertilize the soil, so they got a double benefit in it. Well, let's think about our soil here. And this is about it's from a college, I believe OSU here. It says a single teaspoon or 1 gram of rich garden soil can hold up to 1 billion. Get that, 1 billion bacteria, several yards of fungal filaments, several thousand protozoa, and scores of nematodes, according to Kathy Merrifield, a retired nematologist at Oregon State University. Most of these creatures are exceedingly small. Earthworms and millipedes are giants in comparison. Each one has a role in the secret life of soil. Now, we don't think about that. I remember when we were young, or at least when I was young, I used to love to play in the dirt. I absolutely loved it, right? Nowadays, if you play in the dirt, you're liable to catch some type of flesh-eating bacteria because that's how contaminated the soil is. It didn't get that way on its own, right? It got that way because of the activities of mankind. Bacteria make up the largest group in the soil jungle, and they are as diverse as they are numerous. Some kinds of bacteria are responsible for converting atmospheric nitrogen to plant-available forms, a process known as nitrogen fixation. Actinomycetes, if I've said that correctly, we'll just call them the A guys, with cells like bacteria and filaments like fungi, are thought to contribute chemicals that give newly tilled soil its earthy aroma. Have you ever smelled a nice, freshly tilled soil? Right? And it smells nice. It's kind of like that smell you get after a rain or when a rain's coming, right? Those are microorganisms. Those are bugs that are in the air, that are, in the soil and so forth. Those things, they play a part, and they're very beneficial to mankind when we keep them healthy. And I want to read this article to you about the air because we're talking about the contaminating our soil and air. And this is a fact about our air here. The air you breathe, not only is it in the soil, but the air you breathe is loaded with microbes. So there's lots of microbes in the air as well. The air you breathe is teeming with more than 1,800 kinds of bacteria. Now, not just 1,800 bacteria, and that's all, but 1,800 different kinds of bacteria. There's probably billions and billions of them in the air we breathe. Remember, we talked a little bit about how rain is formed. Rain is formed because water condensates on bacteria. Kind of like your window in the morning. You ever gone outside and you feel that humidity? and then you see rain or water dripping off the side of your house, and you go to your car and there's little droplets of water on it. Well, because moisture needs something to condensate on. And that's what it does in the air. It condensates on little bacteria, little microbes, and then it gets to a point where it's big enough to where eventually it's able to come down in the form of rain. And we'll find out later that those little bacteria actually control the amount of rain that come out of the sky. It's not just a random event. Coupled with the fact that the microbes from the earth can actually call for rain as well. So more than 1,800 different kinds of bacteria, including harmless relatives of microbes associated with bioterrorist attacks, according to a new study. Now, the finding, detailed online this week in the Journal for the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, will allow scientists to create a baseline against which future researchers can measure changes in the bacterial populations due to factors such as climate change. Now, it's interesting because this is close to our neck of the woods. It says the researchers sampled air from San Antonio and Austin, Texas, every day for 17 weeks, and then sent the samples to Berkeley Laboratory for analysis. The two cities are comparable in many regards, including population densities, elevation, and topography, and only differ in that they're about 60 miles apart. The results would show the results would thus show whether background levels of airborne bacteria differ between the two cities. And what they found in there is that for the most part, location didn't make a difference. Weather played a big difference in it. Time of year played a big difference in it. But most of the time, the bacteria remained the same. But in there, they found human DNA, they found spiders, they found blood, STDs, all types of things in the air above it. But when you think about the things we do, and we think about how the earth has to take the output of mankind and bring it back to us in some way, shape, or form, then it kind of puts a more important picture in our minds on the value of what the earth has to do. So that when we're making decisions, we'll make decisions that will only yield beneficial outcomes, right? Because like we said at the beginning of this, what goes around comes around. And that's the part of what we need to do is educate our students to see the big picture in this. There's nothing that we can do that does not create some type of effect, a cause and effect. To every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. So we hope your reaction in this is that you're going to have a little more value for the earth and the environment around us, and let that show through your thoughts and your decisions on an everyday basis. We're going to stop here on page 194, and we'll pick up on the bottom of there. Test your environmental savvy as we get into that little quiz, and David is going to be the next teacher, which is going to be this upcoming Sunday, which will be the 16th, 10/16/2022, 5:30 Central Standard Time. We look forward to seeing you. Thank you for joining us. Have a wonderful evening.